Hi girls, we're going to pick up from where we left off on Friday. Could you please write down the title and the date and in your books? And whenever you're ready, if you could start copying down this table in your books and then complete. Basically class whether these costs here are either fixed or variable. If you could please stop the video in a second and now, really. Okay, well, I'm going to assume that you did that. As usual, I have good intentions. So, right, the answers would be the following. So, loan repayments do not depend on how much output a business produces. So remember that fixed costs do not depend on the amount of production and output of a business, whereas variable costs will change with the amount of output produced by a business. Okay, so repaying a loan would be a fixed cost because it does not depend on how much I have produced. Okay, a salary would also count as fixed. We're going to have a look at this actually in a minute because our specification classes salaries as fixed costs, but income, which is like the umbrella term for salaries, wages, is a bit ambiguous. So we can have a look at that in the next few slides. So anyway, in this case here, a salary definitely is classed as a fixed cost. Components obviously depend on the amount of production by a business. So these will be variable costs, and it goes the same for raw materials. So raw materials are all those kind of input goods that you would need in order to make a good, produce a good. Okay, remember, it's always quite good with these two examples here to remember what I said about Cadbury's. Okay, so in order to make dairy milk bars, they need specific components, okay, and ingredients, and these all count as variable costs. And these obviously will change with the amount of production of chocolate that Cadbury's will develop, okay? But things like rent, which is also fixed cost, salaries of the workers and loans, these things here would be classed as fixed costs because they do not depend on the amount of production by the business, okay? Now, the thing that I'd like to kind of clarify is the fact that salaries and wages, okay, are two kind of different categories of costs. Right, so the difference between a salary and a wage is that a person receives a salary that is paid in a fixed amount per pay period, and a wage earner is paid by the hour or by the amount produced. Okay, so these here are two pictures of basically jobs that I've done in the past when I used to work in Glasgow in this lovely, amazing hotel that you can see here. I used to earn a wage, and now that I work at St Saviour's and St Olave's, I receive a salary. Okay, so the difference is basically that when I worked in this hotel here, my income depended on how many hours I worked. So if I was off sick, let's say for a day, then I would get no income for that day. Whereas here, now that I'm working at St Saviour's and St Olave's, I can be sick for a day or two and still get my salary, okay, which counts as something that is fixed, okay. So it's quite difficult to know what is best, because if I worked extra hours, okay, so think about all those lovely sessions that I do in the afternoon with you guys. If I earned a wage, then I would get paid for those extra hours as well. But because I earn a salary, any kind of hour that I do extra from the ones that I'm assigned in school timetable, any extra hours to that don't get added up to my income, if that makes sense. So, it's difficult to know what is best, because every time I did extra shifts at the hotel, I would get paid more and more. So it was kind of easier to kind of calibrate how much money I would want to make. So yeah, those are kind of like the positive aspects of wages. But then, of course, the negative aspect of wages would be that if I am sick one day, I'm not going to get paid. So it's up to you to decide what is best. But anyway, why are we talking about this? We're talking about this because wages also could potentially depend on the amount that a company produces, okay? And that basically means that wages can count as something that is a variable cost, because if I am let's say, working at the market. Okay, so this is something that happens quite a lot in Italy. So in Italy, we've got a lot of workers that have all this merchandise in a market, okay, in their little banquet in the market, and they hire extra workers to help them out. And depending on how much money they make by selling their goods, okay, so all the tomatoes and salad and so on, they will pay their workers on that basis. So of course, in this case here, a wage would count as a fixed cost, if that makes sense. Okay, so just wanted to clear that out, but don't forget that our specifications, so the OCR exam board counts salaries, obviously, as fixed costs. So if in an exam you see, or even in your coursework, if you start talking about incomes, just kind of assume that incomes will be counted as fixed costs and not variable costs. Okay, only if we're talking about wages, okay, and you explicitly explain that wages depend on the amount produced or the hours worked to produce a good, then that will count as a variable cost. I hope that made sense. Anyway, so just wanted to recap because a few people have emailed me on these two key definitions that have been quite complicated. So a fixed cost, as I said, is a cost that does not change with the amount that a business produces. Okay, so no matter how much chocolate Cadbury produces, they still have to pay rent. Okay, and that rent is going to count as a fixed cost. On the other hand here, variable costs are those costs that change with how much the business produces, okay? So we calculate the total variable cost by looking at the quantity sold, okay, times the variable cost per unit. So let's imagine it costs me 20p to produce a bar of dairy milk, okay? So if I have made in one day 1,000 bars of dairy milk, then to count the variable cost, to calculate the variable cost, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do 1,000 times 20p, and I'm going to get my total variable cost in that sense there. Okay, so it's quite simple, just you need to get used to these kind of definitions. Now, before we look at this actually, I wanted to have a look at the exercise that I gave you on Friday. Okay, so you were asked to class these goods here in these columns here, but there was a bit of room for those kind of ambiguous categories that were not so easy to categorize, to class as fixed or variable costs. Now, wages for full-time staff, by the way, sorry for not completing it, but I wasn't able to do it. I didn't have enough time. Anyway, so wages for full-time staff would count as variable costs, as we said, okay, because if we talk about wages normally, let's just remember that wages are different from salaries and they can depend on the amount produced as well as the hours worked, and as a result we count them as something that is variable in terms of the cost. Heating would count as a fixed cost. Installing MOT equipment, I don't know if you are aware with what MOT stands for. MOT is this test that all UK road vehicles have to take after they're more than 3 years old, okay, and they have to pass it each year in order to prove that they are safe to drive. Okay, so I would count that as a variable cost, although this would be probably quite ambiguous, but I would count it as a variable cost because if you think about the fact that this mechanic is making a service out of the amount of people that come to get their cars fixed, this is an example of a service that they would have to provide, so I would say that that's a variable cost. Then we've got spare parts of the cars, that would be also variable cost. Business rates, so this would stand for the repayment of a business loan. So if this little business has asked for a loan from a bank, they would have to pay an interest, and that would count as a fixed cost because it does not depend on the amount produced. Okay, cash register, I mean, you probably know what this is. It's a machine that is used in shops, and it has a little drawer for money, and it displays the amount for each sale. So that would be a fixed cost because you only buy one of them, and it doesn't really depend, I don't think, on the amount produced. Oil for engines and service would count as a variable cost. Wages for part-time staff would also count as a variable cost. Tools, I would say, would maybe also count as a variable cost because if you only have maybe one type of tool so no, sorry. If you have more and more of the same tool, that could depend on how many people are asking for you to provide the service. So I would say that that could depend on the amount of production. Safety signs, of course, do not depend on the amount produced, so they would be fixed costs. Insurance would also count as a fixed cost because it doesn't depend on production. And then we have coffee for customers, which I would say is quite ambiguous because that could count as something that depends on the amount produced, because of course customers come in and you give them coffee, and you give them coffee depending on how many people come in. But at the same time, if you are always leaving out some coffee out there for people to come in, that could also count as a fixed cost. So as long as you kind of justify that, you should be able to, in an exam, for instance, get the mark. So if you say coffee for customers could be a fixed cost because in my scenario, the mechanics always have the same amount of coffee for X number of customers. Whereas you can say maybe it counts as a variable cost if you don't agree with this, because every time that you give coffee out, it depends on the amount of people that come in to ask for that service. Okay, so that would count as the output. I'm going to stop this video here and I'm going to carry on with the next in a second, okay? Just because I don't want to make this one too long.